Get that nurse out of my briefing room before she trips over something classified. Staff Sergeant Declan Foley said it loud enough that the words bounced off the concrete walls of Forward Operating Base Kadir's Tactical Operations Center, and the 7 Marines seated around the plywood map table did exactly what he expected them to do. They laughed. Not all of them, but enough of them. Enough that the laughter had a shape, had weight, had permission. Foley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over a chest roughly the width of a filing cabinet, and watched the nurse the way a man watches something he's already decided doesn't matter. She was 5'4", slight. Dark hair pulled back so tight it could have been painted on. She held a medical resupply manifest in one hand and said absolutely nothing. Her eyes moved once, not to Foley, not to the Marines laughing, but to the topographical map pinned to the wall behind him. They tracked across the elevation lines the way a finger traces a scar. Then she turned and walked out without a sound. Foley grinned. Somebody tell medical to leash their people. More laughter. He didn't notice that her hands, walking out, were completely still. A person who is afraid has restless hands. A person who is angry has tight hands. Hers were neither. They were the hands of someone who already knew something every man in that room would spend the next 48 hours learning the hard way. If you haven't heard this story, subscribe and stay until the end. Because there's a moment coming where Declan Foley keys his radio and says a name he swore he'd never say with respect. And the silence on the other end lasts long enough to stop his heart. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. 14 months earlier, a different room, a different continent. Lieutenant Commander Joanna Kirka sat in a windowless office at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, while a captain with 3 combat deployments on his chest reviewed her service jacket and said very quietly, "You're sure about this?" It wasn't a question. Kirk's record was the kind that made senior officers uncomfortable because it didn't fit the categories they were trained to think in. She'd completed BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, as part of the integration program's first cycle. She'd graduated first in her class in the Advanced Sniper course at Camp Atterbury. She held a degree in emergency trauma medicine from Johns Hopkins and had completed a fellowship in battlefield surgery that most Navy physicians spent a decade qualifying for. She was 29. She could put a 7.62 millimeter round through a playing card at 800 meters in crosswind, and she could also keep a 19-year-old kid with a severed femoral artery alive long enough to reach a surgical table. The captain looked at her file and looked at her and saw a problem he didn't know how to classify. Kirka looked back at him with the level dark eyes she'd inherited from her grandfather. Master Chief Gunner's Mate Abel Kirka, 31 years in the Navy, 3 wars, a man who had once told her, while she was cleaning a rifle at age 11, "The only opinion that matters is the one the target has after you pull the trigger." She carried those words the way some people carry photographs, not displayed, just present. F.O.B. Kadir sat on the eastern edge of Helmand Province like a tooth knocked loose from the jaw of the desert, dust the color of bone, heat that started at 106 degrees before sunrise and climbed from there. The base served as a forward medical station and logistics hub for 3 Marine companies operating across a 70-kilometer front, and it had exactly 2 things in abundance: wounded personnel arriving faster than the surgical team could process them, and opinions about who belonged there. Kirk arrived on a resupply Chinook with a medical kit, a long rifle case she carried personally, and orders that identified her as a combat trauma specialist attached to the base's medical unit. Nobody read past trauma specialist. Nobody opened the rifle case. The base commander, Colonel Nathan Aldrich, signed her intake paperwork without looking up and told his adjutant to put the new nurse somewhere useful. Kirka didn't correct him. She didn't correct anyone. She reported to the medical bay, organized the surgical resupply inventory in 40 minutes, a task the previous specialist had taken 3 days to complete, and began treating patients with the kind of quiet, systematic precision that made the 2 Navy corpsmen already assigned there go very still and watch her the way you watch someone who is clearly operating on a level you didn't know existed. Petty Officer Second Class Rania Osei, 23, the junior corpsman, looked at Kirk's hands during a chest tube insertion on the second day and said, "Where did you train?" Kirka said, "Everywhere." Osei started paying closer attention. Foley's problem with Kirka wasn't personal. That was the thing about Foley. His cruelty had a system. He was the senior enlisted Marine at Qadir, 6'3", 230 pounds, a voice that could peel paint off armor plating, and he ran the base's tactical operations with genuine competence. His combat record was real. His instincts were tested. His problem was that he had decided, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been contradicted at sufficient volume, that the medical unit was a support function staffed by people who existed to patch up the people who actually mattered. When Kirka walked through the TOC to deliver casualty projections, which she'd calculated herself, using terrain analysis and pattern-of-life data that matched the intelligence section's work with uncomfortable accuracy, Foley looked at her numbers and said, "Cute. Did someone help you with the big words?" He said it in front of 6 Marines. 3 of them laughed. Kirka picked up her projections and left. In the hallway, Private First Class Ito was refilling a water station. He watched her walk past and noticed something he couldn't explain. Her projections folder had a tab labeled Range Card sticking out of the back. He didn't know what a range card was. He forgot about it almost immediately. Osei's own welcome at Qadir had been quieter, but no less precise. On her 3rd day, a Marine sergeant named Lindley had told her, in front of the mess line, that corpsmen should stick to holding hands and leave the thinking to the grunts. Osei had smiled the smile of a woman who'd heard that sentence in 11 different forms across 2 deployments and said nothing. When Kirka found her reorganizing the trauma bay that evening, Osei was working with the focused energy of someone converting anger into competence. Kirka stood beside her and began sorting hemostatic agents by expiration date without being asked. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. Then Kirka said, "You positioned the thoracotomy tray wrong." Osei looked at her. "It should be on the left, closer to the door. If they come in hot, you want your hands on it before you've finished turning around." Osei moved the tray. Kirka said, "Good." It was the first time anyone at Qadir had spoken to her as if she knew what she was doing, and Osei felt something shift, not gratitude, not relief, but the particular steadiness of being seen by someone whose eyes you trusted. They spent the next hour rebuilding the trauma bay's workflow from the ground up. By the time they finished, the space could process 3 simultaneous casualties in half the time. Nobody noticed, except the 2 of them. 4 days later, Foley was holding court in the mess hall, a plywood cavern that smelled like diesel and rehydrated eggs, telling a story about a firefight in Sangin to an audience of 8 Marines, his voice filling the room like a man who'd never encountered a silence he didn't want to conquer. Kirk walked in to get water. Foley interrupted his own story. "Hey, Doc, you ever been in a firefight?" He asked it the way you ask a child if they've ever driven a car. The table waited. Kirka filled her canteen. "If you're ever in one," she said, not looking at him, "you'll want me there." She left. Foley stared at the door for 3 seconds. Then he laughed, but it was a different laugh, shorter, sharper, with a hairline crack in it that only Lindley, sitting closest, seemed to notice. The convoy was supposed to be routine. 12 vehicles, standard resupply run, 36 kilometers to Firebase Dagger and back. Colonel Aldrich approved the route at 0600. Foley briefed the escort element at 0630. At 0714, the lead vehicle cleared the wire. At 7:31, the convoy entered the Panjara Valley, a narrow corridor flanked by ridgelines that rose 300 meters on each side, studded with boulders the size of houses, and dotted with abandoned compounds that hadn't been cleared in 6 weeks. At 0738, the first RPG hit the second vehicle in the column. The explosion was a sound that started in the chest before it reached the ears, a concussive thump that turned the air solid and then shattered it. The vehicle lurched sideways, trailing fire and black smoke. Before the echo died, automatic weapons fire opened from 3 positions on the eastern ridge. Disciplined, overlapping fields of fire, the kind of coordinated ambush that meant planning, rehearsal, and a commander who knew what he was doing. The fourth vehicle took rounds through its engine block and stopped dead, creating a gap in the convoy that split the column in 2. Marines scrambled for cover behind armor panels and wheel wells, returning fire uphill into positions they couldn't see. Foley's voice hit the radio like a hammer. "Contact east, 3 positions, ridgeline, 200 to 400 meters, heavy automatic weapons, RPG. I need air support and QRF now." The response came back in fragments. Air was 40 minutes out. The quick reaction force was engaged at Firebase Dagger. Kadir was on its own. In the TOC, Colonel Aldrich heard the transmission and felt the particular cold that settles in a commander's stomach when the math stops working. 12 vehicles pinned, 3 confirmed casualties already. Enemy fire coordinated and sustained. Air support 38 minutes away. He looked at the personnel board and saw the same thing he'd seen every morning for 3 weeks without understanding what it meant. "Kirka, J. Medical." His hand hovered over the radio. The intelligence sergeant standing beside him said quietly, "Sir, her file. Have you read her actual file?" Aldrich read it in 11 seconds. His face changed. He keyed the radio. "Kirk, TOC. Now." She was there in 90 seconds, and she was carrying the rifle case. Foley heard it on the radio, Aldrich's voice stripped of protocol. "Kirka is moving to overwatch position on the western ridge. She has command authority for counter-sniper operations." The silence on the channel lasted 4 seconds. Then Foley's voice, and every Marine on the frequency heard something they'd never heard in it before. Confusion braided with something that might have been the first thread of fear. "Say again, Kadir. Did you say, Kirka, the nurse?" Aldrich's response was 2 words. "Comply, now." Osei was already moving. Kirk had looked at her once in the TOC, and Osei had picked up the secondary medical kit and the spotting scope without being told. They moved through the base's eastern gate and began climbing the western ridge at a run, while the sound of gunfire echoed through the valley below like a wound that wouldn't close. She set up the position in 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Prone behind a boulder at 740 meters elevation above the valley floor, the Macmillan TAC 338 locked into the bipod, the suppressor threaded tight. Osei settled beside her with the Leupold spotting scope and began calling wind. Wind full value, left to right, 8 knots, gusting to 12. The first thing the Marines in the valley heard on their radios was a voice none of them recognized. Low, flat, clinical, empty of everything except information. Overwatch established. I have eyes on 3 firing positions. Engaging. Foley, crouched behind the second vehicle, with blood on his hands from pulling a wounded Marine to cover, heard that voice and went completely still. It was Kirka, the nurse, and she sounded like she'd done this 1,000 times. The first shot traveled 712 meters in 1.1 seconds. The .338 Lapua Magnum round crossed the valley in a flat arc that compensated for the 12-degree downhill angle, the 8-knot crosswind, and the 600 feet of altitude above sea level, and it struck the RPG gunner in the eastern position at the base of the throat. The sound reached the valley floor a half-second later, a deep, rolling crack that echoed off both ridgelines like thunder arriving from the wrong direction. The RPG clattered off the rocks. The position went silent. "One down," Kirka said. Her voice hadn't changed. Her grandfather's voice, steady in her head. Stillness first. Everything after stillness is easy. Osei, beside her, whispered, "Second position, 200 meters north of first. 3 shooters behind the wall." Kirka shifted. The rifle moved 6 inches. The second shot punched through the wall's firing slit and dropped a gunner mid-burst, his weapon still cycling as he fell. The third shot came 4 seconds later. Same position. Second gunner, trying to drag the first one clear, exposed his shoulder and head for exactly 1.8 seconds. 1.8 seconds was enough. The sound of the .338 was becoming a rhythm now. That deep crack arriving after the impact, so the Marines below saw targets drop before they heard the reason why. Then the valley got worse. The third position, 218 meters from Foley's element, the closest and most dangerous, opened up with a PKM belt-fed machine gun that walked rounds across the convoy's cover like a seamstress stitching a seam. Sparks erupted off armor plating. A side mirror exploded. Foley pressed himself flat and felt a round pass close enough to his head that the pressure change touched his ear like a finger. "Overwatch, I need that PKM down now," he called. And the word he didn't say was "please," but his voice said it for him. Kirk's scope found the PKM position, a reinforced fighting hole behind stacked sandbags with a narrow firing aperture and a competent gunner who was changing his point of aim every 3 bursts. Professional, trained, not militia. 731 meters, Osei said, wind gusting to 14. Kirka exhaled. The crosshairs settled into the 3-inch gap in the sandbags. The PKM fired another burst. Brass casings arced through the dusty air. She pressed the trigger between heartbeats. The round entered the firing aperture, and the PKM stopped mid-burst. The silence where the gun had been was a physical thing, a hole in the sound of the valley, and every Marine below heard it, heard the absence. Foley stared at the position. Nothing moved. "Position 3 neutralized," Kirk said. Same voice, same flat tone, like she was reading a parts inventory. But now, new fighters were moving along the ridgeline. Reinforcements flowing from a compound 500 meters north, 6 of them, spreading into the rocks with the unhurried discipline of men who had rehearsed this. Kirka tracked them through the scope. 6 additional, moving south along the ridge. "Osei, I need ranges every 10 seconds. Osei's voice was steady but faster now. "First pair, 660. Second pair behind the outcrop, 690. Trail pair, 720, moving to cover." The Macmillan spoke. 660 meters. The lead fighter pitched forward into the rocks. His partner froze for 1/2 second, the instinct that kills, and the second round found him before he completed the thought to move. The sound of both impacts reached the valley as a single rolling echo. 690 meters. The third fighter had reached cover behind the outcrop, but cover is only cover if the angle is right. And from Kirka's elevated position, 40 meters of rock protected nothing. She waited until he leaned out to fire and put the round through his rifle's receiver and into his chest. The weapon shattered. The sound was different, metal and stone, and the wet thud of a body dropping onto hard ground. Then the ridge exploded beside her. A burst from a position she hadn't identified. A fourth element, 2 fighters with an RPK, set back on the western slope at her own elevation, 300 meters behind and to her right. Rounds cracked past her head and struck the boulder she was using for cover, spraying rock fragments that sliced across her left forearm like tiny knives. She felt the sting, felt the blood start, felt the pressure wave of a round passing 18 inches above her skull, close enough that the sound wasn't a crack, but a rip, a tearing of the air itself. And for 2 full seconds, she was flat against the earth with stone chips raining onto her back and her face pressed into dirt that tasted like chalk and iron. The world compressed to the sound of her own breathing and the impacts walking closer. Osei had rolled left, dragging the spotting scope, her face white but her hands still on the glass. Behind us, 300 meters, our 7 o'clock, 2 shooters, RPK. Kirk rolled, pulling the Macmillan with her, and the motion exposed her back to the valley for 1.3 seconds. 1.3 seconds during which any competent shooter on the eastern ridge could have ended everything. And she brought the rifle around to a new axis and found the RPK position through a scope now cracked along its left edge from a rock fragment. 300 meters. The RPK gunner was standing, changing his angle for a better shot at her position, and she could see his face clearly at that distance. Young, bearded, concentrating. She fired from an unsupported position, her left arm bleeding, the rifle braced against the boulder at a wrong angle. The round hit him center mass. His partner broke cover and ran. She followed him with the scope for 2 seconds and pressed the trigger at 270 meters. He dropped at the base of a juniper tree that had somehow survived in that blasted landscape. "Overwatch is clear," she said. Her voice had not changed. Her forearm was bleeding freely now, and she pressed a field dressing against it with her teeth and her free hand while continuing to scan. Below, Foley was trying to reach Corporal Adeyemi on the radio. Adeyemi, who'd been positioned at the convoy's rear in the last vehicle. "Adeyemi, this is Foley. Report. Static." "Adeyemi, report status." Static. The empty channel stretched. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds of nothing but the hiss and pop of dead air. And Foley felt something open in his chest that was worse than a bullet, because a bullet is a problem you can solve, and silence is a question that might never answer. 10 seconds. Every Marine on the frequency was listening. Then Adeyemi's voice, broken and breathless. "Hit! Vehicle's gone! I'm behind the wheel. Well, 2 wounded back here. We need medical." Foley closed his eyes for 1/2 second, then opened them. "Overwatch, what's your count?" he asked. And the fact that he was asking her, asking Kirk, the nurse, the woman he'd told to leave his briefing room, for a tactical assessment landed on every radio on the frequency with the weight of a world rearranging itself. 14 confirmed, Kirka said, scanning for remaining. She found them, 3 fighters attempting to reposition toward Adeyemi's vehicle, using a dry stream bed for concealment. Osi spotted the movement. "Stream bed south, 3 movers, 550. The Macmillan fired 3 times in 11 seconds. The first round struck the lead fighter as he crested a rise in the stream bed. The second caught the next man as he tried to reverse direction, a shot through moving legs and shifting dust at 560 meters that hit him in the hip and spun him sideways. The third round, at 540 meters, ended the engagement. Somewhere on the eastern ridge, a final shooter fired a single burst and then stopped. Kirka watched the position for 90 seconds. Nothing moved. The valley was quiet. The quiet was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. Not silence, but the absence of violence, which is a different thing. A thing with texture and weight, like the air itself was exhaling. "Engagement complete," Kirka said. 17 confirmed. Valley is clear. She said it the way someone reads a serial number. Then she unslung the rifle, opened the bolt, safed the weapon, set it beside the boulder, and opened her medical kit. "Osei, we're moving to the convoy. There are wounded." Osei looked at her, this woman whose left arm was wrapped in a field, dressing already soaking through, whose face was cut in 2 places from rock fragments, who had just killed 17 men in under 8 minutes, and was now pulling on surgical gloves with hands that were perfectly steady, and understood something she would spend years trying to articulate. "Moving," Osei said. They reached Adeyemi's vehicle in 4 minutes. 2 Marines were down. Private First Class Tomasz Nowak, 21 years old, from Hamtramck, Michigan, a kid who'd told Osei 3 days ago that he was going to open a pierogi restaurant with his grandmother when he got home, was lying against the wheel with a shrapnel wound in his right thigh that had opened the femoral artery. His face was white. His eyes were wide and wet and fixed on Kirk's face as she knelt beside him and opened the wound with gloved fingers, assessing the damage in 2 seconds. "Am I dying?" he asked. He asked it the way a child asks if the thunder can hurt them, not wanting information, but wanting someone to make the world safe again. Kirka looked him in the eyes. "No," she said. "You're going home to make pierogies." She said it as a fact. She said it as a promise. She said it the way her grandfather said things, without doubt, without qualification, as if the universe operated on the principle that what Joanna Kirka stated became true by the force of stating it. Her hands were already working, tourniquet above the wound, hemostatic gauze packed into the artery, pressure applied with the heel of her palm, while she monitored his pulse with 2 fingers on his wrist. The same hands that had killed 17 men in 8 minutes were now keeping a 21-year-old kid alive, and the precision was identical. The same economy of motion, the same absolute focus, the same stillness at the center of everything. Osei managed the second casualty, a Marine with a penetrating chest wound, and she managed it well, managed it with a speed and surety that would appear in her service record within the week, because Osei had her own skills and her own steadiness, and the fact that Kirka was extraordinary did not make Osei ordinary. Nowak's bleeding stopped. His color stabilized. He looked up at Kirka and said, "Thank you." Kirka said, "Stay still." She was already turning to the next patient. The medevac arrived 22 minutes later. The wounded were loaded. Nowak, conscious, stable, holding the gauze against his own leg with hands that had stopped shaking. The convoy limped back to Kadir. With 3 destroyed vehicles, 2 serious casualties, 0 killed in action. Because of Kirka, because of Osei, because of 17 rounds that arrived exactly where they needed to, when they needed to. From a woman that every man on that base had agreed didn't matter. The TOC at FOB Kadir was the same plywood room where Foley had told her to leave. Same concrete walls, same map table, same fluorescent lights buzzing like trapped insects. Kirka walked in 4 hours after the convoy returned, her left arm properly bandaged now, her face cleaned of dust and blood, still wearing the same fatigues. Foley was standing by the map table. There were 9 Marines in the room, roughly the same number, that had been there when he'd told her to leave, and several of them were the same people, and every single one of them knew it. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. Foley looked at her. She looked back. The room was very quiet. Foley opened his mouth, and for the first time since anyone at Qadir had known him, he couldn't fill the space. His jaw worked. His hands, which normally moved in broad, commanding gestures, were at his sides, and they were still, and the stillness looked wrong on him, the way silence sounds wrong in a room where music has always been playing. "Kirka," he said. His voice was different, lower, stripped, like someone had taken the performance out of it and left only the mechanism. "I said things in this room, in front of people. I said things that—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't just underestimate you, I dismissed you. I made you a joke. I gave other people permission to treat you like a joke. And what happened today, what you did today, that didn't just prove me wrong about your skills. It proved me wrong about—" His voice cracked. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "About what I thought I could see when I looked at a person. About what kind of leader I thought I was. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that almost got people killed." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't explain. He stood there with his hands at his sides and his shoulders lowered, and his voice stripped down to something no one in that room had ever heard from him before. And the Marines watching understood that they were seeing something break. Not a man breaking, but something inside a man breaking. Something that needed to break so that something better could replace it. Kirka was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said 2 words. "I know. Not forgiveness, not vindication, not anger. Acknowledgement." She already knew everything he'd just said. She'd known it before he did. Those 2 words carried the weight of everything she hadn't said in the mess hall, in the briefing room, in the hallway. Every silence converted into 2 syllables that asked for nothing and gave nothing, and somehow, impossibly, contained grace. Colonel Aldrich found her on the medical bay's loading dock an hour later. The sun was going down over the ridgelines, and the sky was the color of a bruise, purple and gold, and something darker underneath. Aldrich stood in the doorway for a long time before he spoke. He looked at the wall of the medical bay. He looked at his own hands. He sat down on a supply crate, deliberately, slowly, placing himself below her eye level, a colonel sitting down to speak upward to a lieutenant commander, and the geometry of it said more than language could. "I signed your intake paperwork," he said, 3 weeks ago. I didn't read your file. I saw medical, and I made a decision about who you were without spending 10 seconds to find out if I was right." He was quiet for a while. The fluorescent light above the door buzzed. Somewhere on the base, a generator coughed and steadied. "That's not your failure, Kirka. That's mine. That's ours. That's a system that let me do that. And I'm the one who's supposed to be checking the system." He looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and not from dust. "I've put in the request to have your tactical designation restored on all base records. And I've recommended you for the commendation your action today warrants. Both of those things should have been unnecessary, because I should have known who was on my base." He stood up, straightened his jacket, looked at her with a steadiness that had cost him something real to achieve. "You're a war fighter, Kirka. 4 words. Not praise. Recognition. The kind that comes from one person who has been in the fire acknowledging another. Kirka nodded once. That was all. The sun continued going down. 3 days later, in the mess hall, a lance corporal named Geddes, 20, Loud, one of Foley's reliable chorus members, was sitting with 2 other junior Marines and said, gesturing toward the medical bay with his fork, "I mean, she got lucky, right? Wind dies down. Clear sight lines could have been—" Foley's hand came down on the table, hard enough to rattle every tray in a 3-meter radius. The mess hall went quiet. Foley stood up, and he was still 6'3", still 230 pounds, still the largest person in every room he entered. But he used that size differently now, not to dominate, but to create a space around the truth that no one could collapse. Let me explain something to you once, Geddes. What Lieutenant Commander Kirka did in that valley was the most skilled piece of shooting I have seen in 11 years in the Marine Corps. She did it while being shot at. She did it while bleeding. She did it after weeks of being told by people like me and people like you that she didn't belong here. And then she put down her weapon and saved Nowak's life with the same hands. You don't have to like it. You don't have to understand it. But you will respect it, or you will answer to me personally. Are we clear? Geddes stared at his tray. Clear, Staff Sergeant. Foley sat back down. He didn't look at anyone. He picked up his fork and continued eating, and the set of his shoulders was different. Not smaller, not defeated, but recalibrated, as if the muscles had been rearranged around a different understanding of what strength was for. Private First Class Ito saw Kirka the next morning. She was walking from the medical bay to the TOC carrying a folder, the same kind of folder she'd been carrying the day he'd seen her in the hallway, the one with the range card tab sticking out. He stopped. She stopped. He looked at the folder, then at her, and something connected behind his eyes. The memory of that tab, the word range card, the thing he hadn't understood then and understood now. You knew, he said, the whole time. You already knew what you could do. Kirka looked at him. 19 years old, 3 weeks in country, standing in a dusty hallway on a base at the edge of the world, trying to make sense of a woman who had been exactly who she was the entire time, and no one had seen it. She saved all of us, Ito said. He wasn't talking to her anymore. He was saying it out loud to himself because he needed to hear the sentence exist in the air. Kirka said, Osei saved some of you too. Then she walked into the TOC. The door closed behind her. That evening, Osei found Kirka cleaning the Macmillan on the medical bay's loading dock. The rifle was disassembled on a cloth, each component gleaming with oil. Osei sat down beside her and was quiet for a while, and the quiet between them was different from the quiet Kirka maintained with everyone else. This was the quiet of 2 people who had been on a ridge together, who had called wind and counted bodies and kept a kid alive, and who didn't need to narrate the meaning of that. I keep hearing the PKM, Osei said finally. The way it stopped. Kirka nodded. She didn't tell Osei it would pass. She didn't tell her it was normal. She reassembled the bolt carrier and set it in place with a click that sounded, in the evening stillness, like a small door closing. You were good up there, Kirka said. Your calls were fast and accurate. You kept working when the rounds came in. Osei looked at her. I was terrified. I know, Kirka said. That's why it counts. The faintest warmth in her voice, barely there, a degree of temperature change in a room. But Osei heard it, and held on to it the way you hold onto a match in a dark place. Not because the darkness is gone, but because someone is in it with you. The following week, Kirka was reassigned to a joint special operations element operating further east. Foley was at the gate when she left. The Chinook was idling on the pad, its rotors turning the dust into a brown curtain that smelled like engine oil and heat. Foley extended his hand. Kirk took it. The handshake lasted 1 second longer than protocol, and in that second, everything traveled. The briefing room, the laughter, the valley, the radio call, the reckoning, the mess hall, the change. Foley said, "Give 'em hell, Kirka." Kirk said, "I always do." She picked up her medical kit in one hand and her rifle case in the other and walked toward the helicopter. Osei was already on board, promoted to senior corpsman of the unit's medical element on Kirka's recommendation, her own name on her own paperwork for the first time. Kirka climbed in and sat down and looked out over FOB Kadir as the Chinook lifted, the plywood buildings, the concrete walls, the loading dock where she'd cleaned her rifle, the TOC where she'd been told to leave, and then been asked to save everyone. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She sat with her hands resting on the rifle case and her eyes level with the horizon and the particular stillness of a woman who had been exactly who she was when it mattered most, and who had never, not once, needed anyone's permission to be it.